A farmer refused to sell his land to developers, but 2 days later, the governor's convoy blocks their bulldozers in a shocking turn of events. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The gravel crunched beneath Harold Winter's worn boots as he stood at the edge of his property, watching the sunset paint the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. At 76, his weathered face bore the marks of a lifetime spent working this land, each wrinkle a testament to years under the unforgiving sun, each callus on his hands earned through decades of honest labor. This farm had been in the Winters family for 4 generations, and Harold had sworn to his father on his deathbed that the land would remain in the family. A promise was a promise, and Harold Winters was a man of his word. The distant rumble of expensive engines drew Harold's attention to the road. A convoy of black SUVs approached, kicking up dust that hung in the evening air like a warning. Harold straightened his back, adjusted his faded cap, and waited. He knew who they were and what they wanted. Meridian Development Corporation had been circling his 300 acres for months, buying up neighboring properties one by one, assembling land for their massive Westview Heights luxury development. Harold's farm was the final piece they needed, the last obstacle in their path. The lead vehicle stopped, and a tall man in an immaculate suit stepped out. Leonard Price, CEO of Meridian, flashed the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Behind him, 2 more men emerged, one carrying a leather portfolio, the other remaining by the car, scanning the property with calculating eyes. "Mr. Winters," Price called out, approaching with his hand extended. "Beautiful evening, isn't it? Perfect timing to discuss the future of this lovely property." Harold didn't take the offered hand. "My land's not for sale, Mr. Price. Told you that last week and the week before. Nothing's changed." Price's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I understand your attachment, sir. Family legacy, sentimental value. We respect that, which is why we've prepared a new offer." He nodded to the man with the portfolio, who stepped forward and opened it. $5 million, Mr. Winters. That's double our previous offer and well above market value." Harold's eyes didn't even flicker toward the paperwork. "Money can't buy everything, Mr. Price. This isn't about the price." "Then what is it about?" Price asked, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. "This development will bring jobs, tax revenue, progress. You're standing in the way of the community's future." From the road came the sound of another vehicle. Harold recognized the beat-up truck belonging to his grandson, Matthew. The young man parked hastily and jogged over, positioning himself beside his grandfather, his posture protective. "Everything okay, Grandpa?" Matthew asked, eyeing the developers suspiciously. "Just fine," Harold replied calmly. "Mr. Price was just leaving, weren't you, sir?" Price looked between the 2 men, his jaw tightening. "Mr. Winters, I don't think you understand the situation. This development is happening. We have the backing of the City Council, the Chamber of Commerce, major investors. Progress doesn't wait for one stubborn old man." "Is that a threat?" Matthew stepped forward, but Harold placed a restraining hand on his arm. "It's reality," Price replied. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "One last chance, Mr. Winters. Call me by tomorrow or things might get complicated." After the developers left, Matthew turned to his grandfather, concern etched on his face. "Grandpa, maybe we should consider—" "Not a chance," Harold cut him off, watching the dust trail from the departing vehicles. "This land isn't just dirt and crops, Matthew. It's our history, our blood and sweat. Some things you don't sell at any price." Later that evening, as the kitchen filled with the aroma of Harold's famous beef stew, the farmhouse came alive with voices. Matthew's sister Emily had arrived with her husband and their 2 young children. Sunday dinner was a sacred tradition in the Winters family. one that Harold had maintained even after losing his wife, Marion, 5 years ago. "They offered how much?" Emily asked, nearly dropping the stack of plates she was setting on the table. "5 million," Matthew replied, filling water glasses. "Cash. That's life-changing money, Grandpa," Emily said quietly, looking at Harold, who was stirring the stew with the same wooden spoon Marion had used for 40 years. "Life's already changed enough," Harold replied without turning around. "What would I even do with that kind of money?" "You could travel," Emily suggested. "See the world like you and Grandma always talked about." "Or invest it," her husband chimed in. "Set up college funds for the kids." Harold shook his head and finally turned to face his family. "And where would we gather for Sunday dinners? In some sterile condo somewhere. This land is your inheritance, your children's inheritance. Some legacies are worth more than money." The conversation continued through dinner, tension occasionally flaring as practical concerns collided with deeply held principles. By the time dessert was served, Marion's apple pie recipe that Harold had perfected over lonely years, an uneasy truce had settled over the family. As everyone was leaving, Harold pulled Matthew aside. "I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice uncharacteristically urgent. "There's a letter in my desk drawer. If anything happens to me or this property, I need you to deliver it personally to Governor Richards." Matthew's brow furrowed in confusion. "Governor Richards? What does the governor have to do with any of this?" "Just promise me, son." "I promise, Grandpa," but a loud knock at the door interrupted them. Harold opened it to find Sheriff Taylor standing on his porch, looking uncomfortable. "Evening, Harold," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Sorry to bother you so late." "What can I do for you, Jim?" Harold asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "Got a complaint about trespassing on the North Field. Meridian Development says you've been blocking their surveyors." Harold's eyes narrowed. "That's my land, Jim. You know that." The sheriff sighed. "They're saying there's some dispute about the property line. They've filed papers with the county." "That's nonsense, and you know it," Harold replied firmly. "My family's owned that land for—" "I know, Harold," the sheriff interrupted. "Just doing my job. They're pushing hard on this one. City council's involved too. Just be careful, all right? These people play rough." After the sheriff left, Matthew looked at his grandfather with growing concern. What did he mean by play rough? Harold gazed out the window into the darkness. "It means we need to be ready. They won't stop with legal maneuvering and cash offers." He turned to his grandson, his eyes glinting with determination that belied his age. "First thing tomorrow, we need to check every inch of our property line, and I need to make a phone call." The following morning brought a clear sky and a sense of foreboding. Harold was up before dawn, checking the ancient shotgun he kept mounted above the fireplace. Not to use, just to be prepared. As the sun breached the horizon, he spotted them. 3 bulldozers and several work trucks parked at the edge of his property, just off the county road. Harold grabbed his hat and headed out to meet this new challenge head-on. As he approached, he saw Price standing with several construction workers and a man in a suit holding documents. "You're trespassing, Price," Harold called out. His voice carrying across the field, the developer turned. That same insincere smile plastered on his face. "Actually, Mr. Winters, we're not. According to these county records, the property line was incorrectly surveyed back in 1963. This portion of the field actually falls outside your deed." Price nodded to the man beside him. "This is Mr. Davis, from the county assessor's office. Everything is quite legal, I assure you." Harold stood his ground, even as Matthew's truck skidded to a halt behind him, his grandson rushing to his side. "What's going on, Grandpa?" Matthew demanded, glaring at the developers. "Apparently," Harold replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him, "Mr. Price thinks he's found a loophole." Matthew stepped forward, hands clenched into fists at his sides. This is ridiculous. That land has been in our family for generations. You can't just show up with some paperwork and... Actually, we can, Price interrupted, his voice smooth as oil. The law is quite clear on this matter. Mr. Davis, would you please explain the situation to these gentlemen? The county official shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Harold. According to our records, there was indeed a surveying error dating back to 1963. The actual property line runs approximately 50 feet north of where you've been farming, Mr. Winters. That's convenient, Harold said, his voice deceptively calm. After 60 years, somebody suddenly discovers this error just when a developer wants my land. Price spread his hands in a gesture of artificial sympathy. Progress has a way of bringing these issues to light. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to begin. He turned to the construction foreman. You may proceed with clearing the disputed area. The bulldozer engines roared to life, belching diesel fumes into the crisp morning air. Matthew moved to step in front of the nearest machine, but Harold grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Not like this, Harold said firmly. We fight this the right way. As they watched the bulldozers begin to tear into the earth, land that Harold had plowed and planted with his own hands for over 60 years, Matthew saw something in his grandfather he'd never witnessed before, tears welling in the old man's eyes. Back at the farmhouse, Harold's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. He dialed a number from memory, one he hadn't called in many years. Governor's office. A crisp, professional voice answered. This is Harold Winters, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I need to speak with Governor Richards. It's urgent. A pause. I'm sorry, sir, but the governor is in meetings all day. Perhaps you could schedule an appointment or speak with one of his staff members. Tell him it's about Elk Creek. 1973, Harold replied. He'll take my call. Another pause, longer this time. One moment, please. Matthew watched his grandfather with growing curiosity. What connection could he possibly have to the governor? And what had happened at Elk Creek? Before he could ask, Harold was speaking again, his voice taking on a warmth and familiarity that surprised Matthew. Jack? It's Harold. Yes, it's been too long. I know. Listen, I wouldn't call if it wasn't important. I need your help. Remember what you said to me that night? Well, it's time to make good on those words. Harold explained the situation briefly, his face growing more animated as he spoke. Tomorrow morning would be perfect. Yes, I understand you're busy. But this can't wait. Thank you, Jack. I knew I could count on you. When he hung up, Matthew couldn't contain his questions any longer. Grandpa, what was that about? How do you know the governor? Harold sank into his armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 76 years. That's a long story, son. One I probably should have told you a long time ago. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down. There are things about this land, about our family, that you need to know. Matthew sat, leaning forward, his curiosity piqued. Back in '73, there was a flash flood that hit the north side of the county, Harold began, his eyes taking on a faraway look. Elk Creek, normally just a trickle, became a raging torrent in a matter of hours. The bridge on Route 16 collapsed. There was a school bus, trying to get kids home before the worst of the storm hit. It got caught on the bridge when it gave way. Harold paused, the memory clearly painful even after all these years. I was driving home from the grain elevator when I saw it happen. The bus was half in the water, tilting more by the second. I pulled over and ran down to the creek. Another man was already there, Jack Richards, though I didn't know who he was at the time. He was a young lawyer then, not the governor. Matthew listened, spellbound, as his grandfather continued. Together, we managed to get all 12 children and the driver off that bus before it was swept downstream. The water was freezing, the current strong. At one point, Jack got pinned against a boulder. I managed to pull him free, but it was close. Too close. You saved the governor's life, Matthew said softly, seeing his grandfather in a new light. Harold nodded. He never forgot it. When he ran for office years later, he tried to thank me publicly, but I refused. Didn't want the attention. But he made me a promise that night. Said if I ever needed anything, all I had to do was ask. And you never asked? Not once in all these years? Never had a reason to, Harold replied simply. Until now. Later that afternoon, the Bulldozers had carved an ugly scar across the north field. Harold stood at the edge of his property, watching as the workers packed up for the day. Price approached, that smug smile still on his face. Reconsidered our offer yet, Mr. Winters? This is just the beginning, you know. The county's investigating other potential surveying errors around your property. You've made your point, Harold replied, his voice weary but unbowed. But this isn't over. Price chuckled. I admire your spirit, I really do. But you're fighting a losing battle. Progress always wins in the end. He gestured to the torn earth behind him. We'll be back tomorrow to continue clearing. Eventually, you'll see reason. After Price left, Matthew joined his grandfather, putting a supportive hand on the older man's shoulder. Will the governor really come through for us, Grandpa? Jack Richards is many things, Harold said, but he's not a man who forgets his debts. He'll be here. That evening, news of the standoff spread through the community like wildfire. By nightfall, neighbors began arriving at the Winters farm, some bringing food, others offering support, a few even volunteering to stand guard overnight. The living room filled with friends and allies, many of whom had also been approached by Meridian with buyout offers. They threatened to have my property condemned if I didn't sell, said Ed Thompson, who owned the hardware store in town. Said it was for the public good. They told me the new zoning laws would make it impossible for me to keep my horses, added Margaret Wilson, a widow who lived on the adjacent property. Made it sound like I had no choice. As the night wore on, it became clear that Meridian's aggressive tactics had alienated much of the community. For many, Harold's stand represented something larger than one man's fight to keep his farm. It was a battle for the soul of their town. By midnight, most of the visitors had gone home, leaving Matthew and Harold sitting on the porch, the old porch swing creaking softly in the cool night air. I've been thinking, Matthew said hesitantly. If this doesn't work, if the governor can't help us, what then? Harold gazed out at the darkened fields, the land his family had worked for generations. Then we keep fighting. Your grandmother always said that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. He turned to his grandson. But Jack will come through. I'd stake my life on it. Inside the house, the phone rang. Matthew hurried to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression. That was Emily. She says the town's buzzing with rumors that the city council's calling an emergency meeting tomorrow to fast-track Meridian's permits. They're moving faster than we thought. Harold nodded gravely. They're scared. Price must have gotten wind of my call to the governor. He stood up, wincing slightly as his arthritic knees protested. Get some sleep, son. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. As dawn broke the next morning, Harold was already up, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of steaming coffee in his weathered hands. The rising sun illuminated the damaged field, making the wound in his land all the more visible. The rumble of engines drew his attention. Not the governor's convoy. It was too early for that. Instead, 3 bulldozers and several work trucks appeared on the horizon, more than had been present the day before. Matthew joined his grandfather at the window, sleep still clouding his eyes. They're starting early, Harold observed, his voice tight. They're trying to get as much done as possible before Jack arrives. Matthew's jaw clenched. We need to slow them down. Before Harold could respond, the sound of more vehicles approaching caught their attention. A stream of cars and trucks was making its way toward the farm. Neighbors, friends, customers from Harold's farm stand, people from town whom he'd known for decades. They parked along the road and in the farm's driveway, spilling out with determined expressions. Ed Thompson approached the house, a bullhorn in his hand. "Thought you could use some reinforcements, Harold. We're not letting them destroy any more of your land today." Tears pricked at Harold's eyes as he nodded his thanks. Together, he and Matthew joined the growing crowd of supporters as they made their way toward the bulldozers, forming a human chain across the property line. Price emerged from the lead vehicle, his face darkening with anger when he saw the crowd. "This is trespassing. All of you are interfering with a legal construction project." "Actually," Ed replied through the bullhorn, "we're standing on Harold Winter's property, supporting a neighbor against corporate bullying. If anyone's trespassing, it's you and your machines." Price's face contorted with rage as he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the sheriff right now. You people are obstructing a legal business operation." Harold stepped forward from the line, his weathered face calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "Go ahead. Call Jim. He knows what's happening here isn't right." The standoff continued for nearly an hour, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky as neither side backed down. The construction workers remained in their vehicles, unwilling to force their way through the human barrier. Price paced back and forth, alternating between heated phone calls and glaring at the protesters. Finally, a sheriff's cruiser appeared on the horizon, lights flashing. Sheriff Taylor stepped out, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. He approached the standoff with measured steps, nodding respectfully to Harold before addressing Price. "What seems to be the problem here?" Price gestured angrily toward the line of protesters. "These people are illegally blocking a permitted construction project. I want them removed immediately." Sheriff Taylor removed his hat, wiping his brow before replacing it. "Mr. Price, I've reviewed those permits of yours. They're for the disputed strip of land only, and until the county fully resolves the property line issue, I can't in good conscience force these people off what might legally be Mr. Winter's property." "This is outrageous," Price spluttered. "You're deliberately obstructing progress. I'll have your badge for this." The sheriff remained unmoved. "Feel free to file a complaint, sir. In the meantime, I suggest everyone keep the peace." He turned to Harold. "I can't stay long, but I wanted you to know that something didn't sit right with me about those county records. I made some calls this morning to some old-timers who used to work at the assessor's office. Apparently, Mr. Davis has been under investigation before for, let's call it, creative record-keeping." Hope flickered in Harold's eyes. "Jim, I appreciate that." "Just doing my job," the sheriff replied quietly before heading back to his cruiser. Price watched him leave, then turned to Harold with cold fury in his eyes. "This changes nothing. I have investors waiting, contracts signed. Your little display of small-town solidarity is touching, but ultimately futile." He checked his watch. "I have a meeting with the mayor in an hour. When I return, I expect these people gone, or the consequences will be severe." As Price and his entourage of suits drove away, a ripple of cautious triumph passed through the crowd. Matthew approached his grandfather, who was thanking each protester individually. "That bought us some time," Matthew said, "but Price isn't bluffing about the mayor. They've been golfing buddies for years." Harold nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We just need to hold out until Jack arrives." He checked his watch. "He should be here within the hour." The crowd thinned somewhat as people needed to leave for work or other obligations, but a solid core remained, setting up lawn chairs and sharing thermoses of coffee. Someone brought a portable radio, and country music drifted across the fields, creating an almost festive atmosphere despite the gravity of the situation. Emily arrived with her family, bringing sandwiches and cold drinks for everyone. She hugged her grandfather tightly. "I'm sorry I doubted you," she whispered. Harold patted her back. "You were thinking practically, just like your grandmother would have." He pulled back, his eyes suddenly misty. Marion always said you had her sense, wanted what was best for the family, even when it was hard. Before Emily could respond, the distant whine of multiple engines caught their attention. Over the ridge, a fleet of construction vehicles appeared, more bulldozers, backhoes, cement trucks, all flying Meridian development flags. "That's a lot more equipment than before," Matthew said, his voice tight with concern. Ed Thompson raised his bullhorn. "Everyone back in position. They're trying to intimidate us." The line reformed, now facing a much more substantial force. The lead bulldozer stopped about 50 yards away, its engine rumbling ominously. Behind the wheel, a man in a hard hat stared impassively at the human barrier. "They wouldn't dare," Emily said, clutching her husband's arm. "Not with all these witnesses." Price's luxury SUV appeared, pulling up alongside the bulldozer. He stepped out, now accompanied by Mayor Wilson and several city council members. The mayor, a portly man with a perpetual politician's smile, approached the line of protesters. Folks, he began, his voice oily with false concern. "I understand your loyalty to Harold here, but you need to understand the bigger picture. This development means jobs, tax revenue, growth. The council has unanimously approved an emergency resolution supporting Meridian's claim to the disputed land." Murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd. Ed Thompson stepped forward. "That disputed land has been farmed by the Winters family for generations. You can't just rewrite history because a developer waves some money in your face." The mayor's smile tightened. "This isn't about money, Ed. It's about the future of our town. Now I'm asking everyone to disperse peacefully." He turned to Harold. "Harold, be reasonable. Meridian has increased their offer to $6 million. Take it, for everyone's sake." Harold stood his ground. "Some things aren't for sale, Robert, not at any price." The mayor sighed dramatically. "Then you leave us no choice." He nodded to Price, who spoke into a walkie-talkie. The bulldozer's engine roared louder, and it began to inch forward. The crowd held firm, though fear was visible on many faces. Matthew positioned himself directly in front of the advancing machine, his grandfather beside him. "They're bluffing," Matthew said through gritted teeth. "They won't run us down." Harold wasn't so sure. He'd seen the hunger in Price's eyes, the kind of greed that rarely stopped for moral considerations. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the sound of sirens cut through the standoff. Over the eastern horizon, a convoy of black SUVs and police motorcycles appeared, lights flashing. The vehicles moved with precision, forming a barrier between the protesters and the construction equipment. From the lead SUV emerged a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and an unmistakable air of authority, Governor Jack Richards. The governor approached with purposeful strides, flanked by state troopers and aides. The mayor's face drained of color as he stepped forward to greet him. "Governor Richards, what a surprise. Had we known you were visiting our humble town, we would have prepared a proper welcome." The governor ignored the mayor's outstretched hand, his eyes scanning the scene with cold assessment. "Mayor Wilson, would you care to explain why I'm witnessing what appears to be an attempt to intimidate citizens exercising their right to peaceful protest?" Before the flustered mayor could respond, the governor spotted Harold and his face transformed, breaking into a genuine smile. He strode past the mayor and embraced the old farmer. "Harold, it's been too long, my friend." "Jack," Harold replied, returning the embrace. "I appreciate you coming." The governor turned to face the developers and local officials, his expression hardening again. "Would someone like to explain why Meridian Development is attempting construction on disputed land before the property line issue has been fully resolved?" Price stepped forward, quickly regaining his composure. "Governor, with all due respect, this is a local matter. The City Council has reviewed the situation and supports our project moving forward." "Is that so?" the governor replied, his voice deceptively mild. Then perhaps you can explain why I received a call this morning from the State Historical Preservation Office expressing grave concerns about potential historical artifacts on this very property. He turned to Harold with a wink so quick, only the old farmer caught it. Artifacts that would trigger a mandatory archaeological survey before any development could proceed. Confusion flickered across Price's face. Historical artifacts? There's been no mention of... Additionally, the governor continued, raising his voice slightly, I've been informed that Elk Creek, which runs through the northern section of this property, is being evaluated for protection under the State Watershed Conservation Act due to the presence of endangered riparian wildlife. Harold fought to keep a straight face. Jack was pulling out all the stops, invoking every environmental and historical protection he could think of. The governor addressed the crowd. Citizens, I appreciate your civic engagement today. Rest assured, the state will ensure that all proper procedures are followed before any development proceeds on potentially historically significant land. Price's face darkened as he stepped closer to the governor, lowering his voice. Governor Richards, Meridian Development has invested millions in this project. Our investors include some of your largest campaign contributors. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. The implied threat hung in the air, but Governor Richards merely smiled. A politician's smile that never reached his eyes. By all means, Mr. Price. I'm always happy to discuss matters of public interest. My office will schedule something next week. He turned back to address the crowd again. In the meantime, I'm issuing an executive order for a 30-day moratorium on any construction in this area pending full environmental and historical reviews. A cheer went up from the protesters. The mayor stepped forward, visibly flustered. Governor, with all due respect, you're overstepping your authority. The city council has already... Actually, Mayor Wilson, the governor interrupted smoothly, state law is quite clear on this matter. When potential historical artifacts or endangered species are involved, the state has authority to temporarily halt development pending proper investigation. He nodded to one of his aides, who handed him a document. This executive order is effective immediately. Harold watched as Price snatched the document, scanning it with increasing fury. The developer crumpled the paper in his fist, then smoothed it out again, seemingly trying to control his temper. This is a delaying tactic, nothing more, Price said through clenched teeth. It changes nothing in the long run. The governor placed a firm hand on Harold's shoulder. Perhaps. But the law is the law, Mr. Price. I suggest you instruct your operators to move those machines off this property until the reviews are complete. For a moment, it seemed Price might refuse, but after a tense silence, he barked orders into his walkie-talkie. Slowly, the bulldozers and other equipment began to back away, their engines growling in reluctant retreat. As the construction vehicles departed, the crowd broke into applause. Governor Richards raised his hands, calling for quiet. This is just a temporary measure, folks. There's still work to be done to permanently resolve this situation. But today, at least, we've ensured that due process will be followed. While the governor spoke with some of the other protesters, Harold pulled Matthew and Emily aside. We need to talk privately, he said, his voice low and urgent. Back at the house. Once inside the farmhouse kitchen, Harold closed the curtains and turned to his grandchildren. Jack bought us some time, but Price was right about one thing. This is just a delay. We need to use these 30 days wisely. Emily sat at the table, her expression troubled. Grandpa, what did the governor mean about historical artifacts? Is there something on the property we don't know about? Harold chuckled. Jack always was quick on his feet. There are no artifacts, at least none that I know of. That was his way of giving us breathing room. He paused, his expression growing serious again. But there is something about this property that very few people know, something that's been kept secret for almost 50 years. Matthew and Emily exchanged puzzled glances. What kind of secret? Matthew asked. Before Harold could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Governor Richards, accompanied by 2 state troopers, who remained respectfully outside. "Sorry to intrude," the governor said as Harold ushered him in. "But we need to talk strategy, old friend. Price is already on the phone with his lawyers, and the mayor's calling in favors at the state capitol." Harold nodded, gesturing for the governor to join them at the table. "Jack, these are my grandchildren, Matthew and Emily. Kids, as you've probably figured out, this is Governor Jack Richards, though when I met him, he was just Jack, a young lawyer with more courage than sense." The governor smiled warmly, shaking hands with both. "Your grandfather saved my life during that flood," something he conveniently left out of the story whenever it was told. His expression turned serious as he addressed Harold again. "They'll challenge the executive order, Harold. It'll probably hold for the 30 days, but not much longer." "I know," Harold replied. "I was just about to tell the kids about the creek." Understanding dawned in the governor's eyes. "Ah, so that's why you called me specifically. I thought it was just about our history." Harold shook his head. "The debt between us was paid long ago, Jack. This is about something bigger, something we both swore to protect." Emily leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What are you talking about, Grandpa?" Harold took a deep breath. "Elk Creek isn't just any stream. Back in 1973, before the flood, the creek ran a different course through a limestone cavern system beneath the North Field. The flooding collapsed part of the cavern, diverting the creek to its current path." He paused, glancing at the governor, who nodded for him to continue. "When Jack and I were rescuing those children from the school bus, we discovered something in the exposed cavern, something that would have caused a sensation if it had become public knowledge." "What was it?" Matthew asked, completely engrossed. "A burial site," Harold replied quietly. "Not just any burial site, but one containing artifacts and remains that the archaeologists who later examined it believed to be over 10,000 years old, potentially some of the earliest human remains ever found in this region." Emily gasped. "So there really are historical artifacts on the property?" The governor nodded. "A handful of us knew, Harold, myself, 2 archaeologists from the state university, and eventually, when I became governor, I had to brief certain officials at the State Historical Preservation Office. But the site itself was carefully resealed and its location kept secret." "But why?" Matthew asked, bewildered. "Wouldn't a discovery like that be important for science, for history?" Harold's expression was solemn. "The remains belong to indigenous people, ancestors of tribes still living in this region. The archaeologists determined that exposing the site would likely lead to looting, despite any protections we might put in place. There were ceremonial items, you see, things that would fetch a high price on the black market. So we made a decision," the governor continued. "With the blessing of tribal elders who were consulted in confidence, the site was documented thoroughly but kept secret. Harold became its unofficial guardian, with a legal covenant attached to the property deed that wasn't publicly recorded." Emily shook her head, still processing this revelation. "So all these years you've been protecting an ancient burial ground. That's incredible, Grandpa." "It's a responsibility," Harold said simply. "One I've taken seriously. One I hope to pass on to both of you someday, when the time was right." He turned to the governor. "And now that secret may be our best defense against Meridian development." The governor rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "If we make the site's existence public now, it would certainly stop the development in its tracks. The land would likely be designated as a protected cultural heritage site. But it would also expose the burial ground to the very risks we've been trying to avoid for all these years." "There must be another way," Matthew said. "Something that stops Meridian without exposing the site." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as they all considered the dilemma. Finally, Emily spoke up. "What if we don't need to make the actual location public? Just the fact that there's a significant archaeological site somewhere on the property would trigger protections, wouldn't it? The governor's eyes lit up. That might work. We could announce that preliminary ground testing has revealed evidence of potential archaeological significance, without specifying the exact nature or location. That would trigger a much more intensive review process, one that could take years. Price and Meridian wouldn't wait years, Matthew added, catching on to the strategy. They'd abandon the project and look elsewhere. Harold nodded slowly, hope dawning on his weathered face. It could work, but we'd need to move quickly, before Price's lawyers can challenge your executive order. Leave that to me, the governor said, standing up with renewed purpose. I'll have the State Historical Preservation Office issue a preliminary finding by tomorrow morning. Once that's on record, it will be much harder for Meridian to proceed, regardless of what happens with the executive order. As the governor prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to Harold. Are you sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no turning back. The property will likely be placed under permanent restrictions. Harold looked out the window at the fields his family had farmed for generations. I'm sure, Jack. This land was never mine to sell in the first place. I've just been its caretaker. He looked at his grandchildren, as they will be after me. After the governor departed, Harold sat heavily in his favorite kitchen chair, the events of the past 2 days clearly taking their toll. Matthew placed a gentle hand on his grandfather's shoulder. You okay, Grandpa? It's been intense. Harold patted his grandson's hand. Just tired, son. Not as young as I used to be. He looked up at his grandchildren, his eyes filled with both weariness and resolve. I'm sorry I never told you about the burial site. Your grandmother was the only other person in the family who knew. We decided it was safer that way. Emily pulled up a chair beside him. All these years I thought you were just being stubborn about the farm because of tradition or sentimentality. I had no idea you were protecting something so important. It's both, Harold replied. This land is our heritage, but it's also a trust. Those people were here long before the Winters family arrived. Their resting place deserves respect. Matthew's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He checked it, and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. Word travels fast. That was Sarah from the local news. Apparently, Price just called an emergency press conference at City Hall. It's starting in 20 minutes. We should be there, Emily said, rising quickly. See what he's planning. Harold nodded. Go. I'll stay here. Too tired to face another confrontation today. As his grandchildren headed for the door, he called after them. Be careful. Price isn't just going to roll over and accept defeat. The City Hall press room was packed when Matthew and Emily arrived. Local reporters jostled with news crews from the nearest big city, all drawn by the drama of the standoff and the governor's unexpected intervention. Mayor Wilson stood nervously at the side of the podium, while Leonard Price adjusted the microphone, his face a carefully composed mask of professional concern. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Price began, his voice smooth and controlled. As many of you know, Meridian Development has been planning a transformative project for this community, one that would create hundreds of jobs and generate millions in tax revenue. Unfortunately, that vision is now threatened by last-minute obstructionism and political interference. Matthew and Emily exchanged glances as they stood at the back of the room. Price was framing this as an economic issue, painting himself as the victim. Today, Governor Richards abused his executive authority to halt a fully permitted, legally approved development based on vague, unsubstantiated claims about potential archaeological findings. Price shook his head in theatrical dismay. This is politics at its worst, a personal favor to a campaign donor at the expense of an entire community's economic future. Murmurs rippled through the assembled press. Emily whispered to Matthew, "That's ridiculous. Grandpa's never donated to a political campaign in his life." "It doesn't matter," Matthew whispered back. "He's controlling the narrative." Price continued, his voice rising passionately. But Meridian Development remains committed to this community, which is why today I'm announcing an even more generous offer to resolve this situation. $10 million to purchase the Winters Farm, plus a commitment to name the Central Park in our development Winters Heritage Park in honor of the family's contribution to this community. Cameras flashed as Price paused for effect. Additionally, we will establish a $1 million scholarship fund for local students pursuing agricultural education. All we ask in return is that the Winters family and Governor Richards drop their baseless objections and allow progress to move forward. A reporter shot up her hand. Mr. Price, have you spoken directly with Mr. Winters about this new offer? Not yet, Price admitted. But I'm confident that once the emotion of the moment passes, reason will prevail. Harold Winters is a practical man. $10 million can do a lot of good for his family and this community. Another reporter called out, "What about the governor's claims regarding potential historical artifacts and endangered species?" Price's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Our environmental impact studies found no evidence of endangered species in the area. As for these sudden claims about historical artifacts, how convenient that they appear precisely when the governor's old friend needs a favor. We're prepared to conduct additional surveys, of course, but we believe they'll find nothing of significance. As the press conference continued, Emily felt a growing sense of unease. Price was skilled at manipulating public opinion, and his new offer was designed to paint Harold as selfish if he refused. She glanced at her brother and could tell he was thinking the same thing. After the press conference, they hurried back to the farm, finding Harold dozing in his armchair. He awakened as they entered, immediately alert to their concerned expressions. "That bad, huh?" he asked, straightening up. Matthew summarized Price's press conference while Emily made fresh coffee. When he mentioned the $10 million offer, Harold shook his head in disgust. He thinks everything has a price tag. "It's a clever move," Emily said, bringing mugs of coffee to the table. "He's trying to make you look unreasonable if you refuse. The stubborn old man denying the town progress and prosperity." Harold took a sip of his coffee. "Let them think what they want. I know what's right." Matthew's phone rang. It was the governor. After a brief conversation, Matthew's face fell as he hung up. "Bad news. Price's lawyers are moving faster than expected. They've already filed for an emergency injunction against the governor's executive order. There's a hearing tomorrow morning." "That was quick," Emily remarked. "Money talks," Harold replied grimly, "and Meridian has plenty of it. What did Jack say about the Historical Preservation Office?" Matthew sighed. "They're rushing to issue the preliminary finding, but there's bureaucracy involved. It might not happen before the hearing." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. The legal maneuver could potentially remove their 30-day breathing room, allowing Meridian to resume construction while the historical review was still pending. The ringing of the doorbell broke the tension. Emily went to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression. "It's Mr. Davis from the county assessor's office. He says he needs to speak with you urgently, Grandpa." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Send him in." Davis entered the kitchen clutching his hat, his face etched with anxiety. Without preamble, he blurted out, "Mr. Winters, I need to confess something. The property line discrepancy, it's not real. I altered the records at Mr. Price's request." The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Matthew stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You falsified official county records?" Davis nodded miserably. "Price approached me months ago, offered to pay off my gambling debts if I found a way to create a legal question about your property line, Mr. Winters. He said it was just a negotiating tactic, to pressure you to sell. I never thought it would go this far." "Why are you telling us this now?" Emily demanded. "Because the sheriff came to see me after he left your place this morning. Said he was investigating irregularities in the county records." Davis wrung his hat in his hands. I'm coming clean before it gets worse. I've already given a signed statement to Sheriff Taylor. Harold stood slowly, fixing Davis with a steady gaze. You betrayed the public trust for money. That's on your conscience. But coming forward now, that took courage. Davis couldn't meet his eyes. Price will ruin me when he finds out. We'll make sure you have protection, Matthew said. This changes everything for our case. After Davis left, escorted by Sheriff Taylor, who had been waiting outside, the family gathered around the kitchen table again, the mood considerably lighter. This is the break we needed, Emily said excitedly. With Davis's confession, the whole basis for Meridian's initial entry onto the property collapses. They were trespassing, plain and simple. Harold nodded thoughtfully. It helps, but it's not enough by itself. Price will just claim he was misled by Davis and find another angle of attack. We still need the historical designation to provide long-term protection. Matthew checked his watch. It's getting late. The hearing is at 9 tomorrow morning. We should try to get some rest. As Emily and her family prepared to leave, she hugged her grandfather tightly. We'll be here first thing in the morning to drive you to the courthouse. Harold kissed her cheek. I'm blessed to have you both fighting alongside me. Your grandmother would be proud. After they left, Harold sat alone in the quiet farmhouse, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the old structure. He walked to the window, gazing out at his fields silvered by moonlight. Somewhere beneath that peaceful landscape lay the ancient burial site, a sacred trust he had guarded for decades. We're close, Marion, he whispered to his late wife's memory. Just one more fight to keep our promise. The county courthouse stood as a monument to small-town dignity, a red brick building with white columns and a copper dome that had long ago turned green with age. By 8:30 the next morning, the steps were crowded with supporters holding handmade signs reading, Save Winter's Farm and People Over Profit. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers. Harold climbed the steps slowly, Emily and Matthew flanking him protectively. Despite the gravity of the situation, he felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened today, he had done everything possible to honor his promise. Inside, the main courtroom was already packed to capacity. Price and his team of lawyers occupied the left side of the room, their expensive suits and leather briefcases marking them as outsiders in this rural community. Governor Richards sat on the right with his legal counsel, nodding respectfully as Harold and his family entered. Judge Eleanor Harmon, who had presided over the county's legal matters for 25 years, entered promptly at 9. The courtroom rose, then settled into an expectant hush as she adjusted her glasses and surveyed the crowded room. Well, she began dryly, it seems we have quite the local controversy on our hands. This is a hearing on Meridian Development's request for an emergency injunction against Governor Richards's executive order temporarily halting construction on the Winters property. She looked over her glasses at the assembled lawyers. Am I correct in my understanding that there are now additional issues involving alleged falsification of county records? Price's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Benson, stood immediately. Your Honor, those allegations are completely separate from the matter at hand. The executive order was an overreach of gubernatorial authority based on speculative claims about historical artifacts that conveniently appeared just as our project was moving forward. The governor's counsel, a composed woman in her 50s, rose next. Your Honor, the state contends that the executive order was well within the governor's authority under the State Antiquities Act. Furthermore, we've received preliminary findings from the State Historical Preservation Office indicating potential archaeological significance on the property. Judge Harmon raised an eyebrow. I'd like to see those findings, Counselor. They were just completed this morning, Your Honor, the governor's lawyer replied, approaching the bench with a document bearing official seals. Price leaned over to whisper urgently to Benson, who nodded and stood again. Your Honor, We object to the introduction of last-minute evidence that we haven't had the opportunity to review. Noted, Judge Harmon replied, studying the document. But considering this is an emergency hearing that your clients requested, I think we can forgive some procedural shortcuts on both sides. She looked up, addressing both attorneys. I'll hear arguments, but first, I believe Sheriff Taylor is present with information relevant to this case. The sheriff stepped forward from the back of the courtroom, hat in hand. Your Honor, yesterday morning I began an investigation into irregularities in county property records concerning the Winters farm. Last night, County Assessor Davis provided a signed statement admitting that he falsified records at the request of Leonard Price of Meridian Development, creating the appearance of a property line dispute where none existed. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Price's face darkened as all eyes turned toward him. That's an outrageous accusation, Benson objected. Mr. Price had no knowledge of any falsification, if indeed one occurred. Mr. Davis is clearly attempting to shift blame for his own misconduct. Judge Harmon held up a hand. I haven't seen this statement yet, and these allegations, while serious, are not directly before me today. However, she paused, looking sternly at Price's legal team. If construction was initiated based on fraudulent property records, that would certainly color my view of the current request for an injunction. The governor's attorney seized the opening. Your Honor, given these new allegations of fraud, we ask that the court not only uphold the governor's executive order, but extend it pending a full investigation into Meridian Development's conduct. Benson rose again. Your Honor, my client has invested millions in this project based on approvals granted in good faith by the City Council. Even if there were irregularities with the initial property line assessment, which we do not concede, the fundamental case for the development remains sound. The only thing stopping progress is this 11th-hour claim about potential historical artifacts that no one has seen evidence of until today. Harold listened to the legal maneuvering with growing frustration. The argument seemed to be drifting away from the core truth, that this land held something precious that deserved protection. He leaned over to Matthew and whispered something. His grandson's eyes widened, then he nodded and quickly wrote a note that was passed to the governor's counsel. The attorney read it, glanced back at Harold with a questioning look, then nodded subtly before standing again. Your Honor, Mr. Winters would like to address the court, if permitted. Judge Harmon considered this. While unusual, given Mr. Winters' central role in this matter, I'll allow it. Mr. Winters, please come forward. Harold approached the front of the courtroom slowly, his worn boots echoing on the polished floor. He stood before the judge, his work-hardened hands clasped before him, his bearing dignified despite his simple clothes. Thank you, Your Honor. I'm not a lawyer or a politician. I'm just a farmer who's lived on the same land for over 70 years. Harold's clear voice carried throughout the silent courtroom. There's been a lot of talk about progress and profit, about property lines and permits, but there's something more important at stake here. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Back in 1973, after the Elk Creek flood, Governor Richards, then just a young lawyer, and I discovered something on my land. Something that the archaeologists who examined it later called a find of extraordinary historical significance. A burial site dating back thousands of years. Murmurs swept through the courtroom. Price and his attorneys exchanged alarmed glances. The site was documented but kept secret to protect it from looting and desecration, Harold continued. Only a handful of people knew. Myself, Governor Richards, 2 archaeologists from the State University, and tribal elders who were consulted. For nearly 50 years, I've been the caretaker of that sacred ground, a responsibility I took on willingly. Judge Harmon leaned forward. Mr. Winters, are you saying there is indeed archaeological evidence on your property, not just a potential for discoveries? Yes, Your Honor. The documentation has been held in confidence at the State Historical Preservation Office all these years. I've authorized them to release it to the court today. Harold's gaze swept across the courtroom, landing finally on Price. "Some things are worth more than money, Mr. Price. Some trust can't be broken, no matter the price tag." As Harold returned to his seat, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Judge Harmon gavelled for order, her expression thoughtful as she surveyed the scene before her. "In light of Mr. Winters's testimony and the documentation provided by the State Historical Preservation Office, I'm denying Meridian Development's request for an injunction. Furthermore, I'm extending the governor's executive order for 90 days to allow for a comprehensive archaeological survey of the property." She fixed Price with a stern gaze. "And I'm referring the allegations of record falsification to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation." Before the gavel could fall, Benson jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, we request a stay pending appeal. My client stands to lose millions if this project is delayed further." "Request denied," Judge Harmon replied firmly. "Potential archaeological sites of significant historical value are irreplaceable. Once destroyed, they cannot be recovered. Financial investments, while substantial, do not outweigh this consideration." She brought down her gavel with finality. "This hearing is adjourned." As they exited the courthouse, Harold was mobbed by well-wishers and reporters. Governor Richards appeared at his side, a supportive hand on his shoulder as cameras flashed around them. "Harold made the difficult decision to reveal a secret he's kept for decades," the governor told the assembled press. "He did so not for personal gain, but to protect a priceless cultural heritage that belongs to all of us. That's the kind of courage and integrity that has always defined this man." Through the crowd, Harold caught sight of Price standing by his car, his face a mask of barely controlled fury as he spoke intensely with his attorneys. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, the developer who saw land only as a commodity to be exploited, and the farmer who understood it as a sacred trust. Price looked away first, getting into his car and slamming the door. "Is it over?" Emily asked quietly as they made their way down the courthouse steps. "Not quite," Harold replied. "Price won't give up easily, but we've bought ourselves time, and sometimes that's all you need for the right thing to prevail." The days following the courthouse victory brought a flurry of activity to the Winters farm. Archaeologists from the State University arrived to begin their survey, carefully marking off sections of the north field with colored flags and stakes. News crews came and went, hungry for updates on the story that had captured national attention. Local residents stopped by with casseroles and pies, offering congratulations and support. Harold watched it all with mixed emotions. The secret he had kept for nearly 5 decades was now public knowledge. While the exact location of the burial site remained protected, the world now knew that his ordinary-looking farm held extraordinary historical significance. On the 3rd morning after the hearing, Harold sat at his kitchen table with Dr. Elaine Rodriguez, the lead archaeologist, reviewing maps of the property. Based on the original documentation from 1973, we've identified the general area where the site should be, Dr. Rodriguez explained, pointing to a section of the map. But the landscape has changed significantly since the flood. We'll need to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys to pinpoint the exact location, without disturbing anything. Harold nodded, studying the map with a critical eye. The cavern entrance collapsed decades ago, but I can show you approximately where it was. Marion and I always made sure no plowing or deep digging happened in that area. That's extremely helpful, Mr. Winters, and I want to commend you for your stewardship all these years. Many sites like this have been lost to development or farming practices. The kitchen door opened, and Matthew entered, followed by 2 men in suits whom Harold didn't recognize. The younger man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Winters, I'm James Eagle Feather from the Tribal Heritage Preservation Office. This is Elder Robert Standing Bear. We understand you've been protecting a site of significance to our people." Harold stood, shaking hands respectfully. "It's an honor to meet you. Please join us." As they gathered around the table, Elder Standing Bear studied Harold with wise, knowing eyes. For generations, our stories told of ancient burial grounds in this valley. Many thought they were just legends, lost to time. But you kept this one safe. I did what seemed right, Harold replied simply. James Eagle Feather spread out several documents. We've reviewed the photos and notes from 1973. Based on the artifacts described, this almost certainly belongs to the ancient river people, ancestors to several modern tribes in this region, including ours. The Preservation Office has filed for expedited designation of the site under the National Historic Preservation Act. What would that mean for the farm? Matthew asked. The burial site itself would receive federal protection, James explained. But Mr. Winters would retain ownership of the land, with certain restrictions on activities that might disturb the site. Harold looked relieved. So the farm could still operate? Still stay in the family? Absolutely, Dr. Rodriguez assured him. We'd work with you to establish a management plan that respects both the archaeological site and the working farm. The conversation continued, delving into technical details and legal considerations. Elder Standing Bear remained mostly silent, occasionally asking a thoughtful question or offering a perspective that bridged scientific and spiritual understandings of the site. As they were wrapping up, Sheriff Taylor's cruiser pulled into the driveway. Harold excused himself to meet the sheriff on the porch. "Morning, Jim. What brings you out here?" The sheriff removed his hat, his expression grave. "Just wanted to give you a heads up, Harold. Leonard Price was released on bail this morning." Harold's eyebrows shot up. "Bail? He was arrested. Last night, the DA moved fast on the evidence from Davis's confession, charged Price with fraud, corruption of a public official, and trespassing." Sheriff Taylor shook his head. "He's facing serious charges, but he's also got serious money for lawyers, and he doesn't look happy about any of this." "I appreciate the warning, Jim. I've increased patrols past your property, just in case. But stay alert." The sheriff replaced his hat. "Oh, and one more thing. Mayor Wilson announced his resignation this morning. Seems he didn't want to wait for the corruption investigation to reach his office." After the sheriff left, Harold returned to the kitchen, sharing the news with the others. "Price is the type to hold a grudge," Matthew observed worriedly, "especially now that he's facing criminal charges." Dr. Rodriguez looked concerned. "Perhaps we should increase security around the site survey area." Elder Standing Bear raised a weathered hand. "Our people will help watch over this place. We have young men and women who would be honored to serve as guardians of their ancestors' resting place." "That's generous," Harold said gratefully. "This land has been my responsibility for so long. It feels right to share that duty now, especially with those who have a deeper connection to it." Later that afternoon, the tribal representatives departed, promising to return soon with volunteers to assist with site protection. Dr. Rodriguez and her team continued their preliminary survey work, establishing a grid pattern across the north field. Harold walked the perimeter of his property as the sun began its descent, a daily ritual he'd maintained for decades. Matthew joined him, both men silent for a time as they surveyed the fields glowing gold in the evening light. "You've been quiet today, Grandpa," Matthew finally said. "Everything okay?" Harold paused, leaning on the old fence post. "Just thinking about change. For almost 50 years I kept that secret, just Marion and me, and later just me. Protected it like it was the most precious thing in the world. It is precious. Yes, but now..." Harold gestured toward the archaeologists working in the distance. "Now it belongs to everyone, as it should, but it changes things." Matthew studied his grandfather's profile, understanding dawning. "You're wondering what your purpose is now, if the secret is out and others are helping protect the site." Harold smiled faintly. "You always could read me like a book. Your grandmother said you had the gift. The farm is still yours, Grandpa. The land still needs you." "Maybe," Harold acknowledged. "But maybe it's time to think about the future, too. Your future. Emily's. The next generation of Winters to care for this place. Before Matthew could respond, the sound of tires on gravel drew their attention. A sleek black car was approaching the farmhouse, moving too fast for the rural drive. It skidded to a stop, and Leonard Price emerged, his usual polished appearance noticeably disheveled. His face was flushed with anger as he slammed the car door. "Winters!" he shouted, stalking toward them. "You think you've won? You've ruined my reputation, cost me millions, gotten me arrested, all over some old bones." Harold stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Matthew. "You did this to yourself, Price. No one told you to falsify records or bribe officials. Don't get self-righteous with me, old man. You hid critical information about your property for decades. That burial site should have been registered with the state years ago." "It was registered," Harold replied calmly, "just not publicly. Everything was done legally with the proper authorities involved." Price laughed bitterly. "Oh, sure. Your old buddy the governor made sure of that, didn't he? Well, it doesn't matter now. Your little victory celebration won't last long." Matthew stepped forward. "You need to leave now, before I call Sheriff Taylor." "Oh, I'm going," Price sneered. "But remember this, Meridian Development doesn't lose. We've invested too much to walk away. If we can't build here, we'll build around you. We'll surround this precious farm of yours with development so dense you won't be able to see the sunset anymore." He jabbed a finger toward Harold. "You'll die knowing you destroyed your family's future for nothing." As suddenly as he had arrived, Price got back in his car and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Harold and Matthew exchanged troubled glances. "He meant it," Matthew said quietly. "That wasn't just angry bluster." "I know," Harold replied, watching the dust settle on the driveway. "Price is a wounded animal now, and wounded animals are the most dangerous kind." From the north field, one of the archaeologists called out excitedly. They had found something with the ground-penetrating radar. A clear image of what appeared to be the collapsed cavern system, almost exactly where Harold had indicated it would be. As they walked toward the commotion, Harold couldn't shake Price's parting threat. The battle for his land might have been won, but the war, it seemed, was far from over. Price's threat materialized faster than anyone expected. Just 1 week after his confrontation with Harold, full-page advertisements appeared in local and regional newspapers announcing Meridian Estates, a massive luxury development that would completely surround the Winters farm. The glossy renderings showed high-end homes, shopping centers, and a golf course encircling a conspicuously empty patch of land in the center, Harold's 300 acres, depicted as an island in a sea of development. "He's trying to isolate us," Matthew said, spreading the newspaper across Harold's kitchen table. "Look at the road plans. The only access to our property would be through their main entrance. They could control who comes and goes." Harold studied the plans with a frown. "Can they legally do that? Cut off our road access?" "I'm not sure," Emily replied, pointing to a section of the advertisement. "They're claiming they've already secured options to purchase all the surrounding properties. If that's true, they might be able to reroute the county road." The news hit the community like a thunderclap. Neighbors who had stood with Harold against the Bulldozers now faced difficult decisions about their own properties. Meridian was offering above-market prices, with bonuses for quick acceptance. For many struggling family farms, the temptation was overwhelming. By the end of the week, for sale signs began appearing on neighboring properties. Each one felt like a small betrayal to Harold, though he understood the economic realities his neighbors faced. "Don't blame them," he told Matthew and Emily as they drove past yet another property marked for sale. "Farming's not the life it once was. Most of these folks are just getting by. Hard to turn down that kind of money." "But if everyone sells, Price gets exactly what he wants," Emily protested. "He'll suffocate us with development." Harold nodded grimly. "That's his plan. Make it so unpleasant to stay that we'll eventually give in." That evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching the sun set. A line of vehicles appeared on the horizon. But these weren't construction trucks or developers' SUVs. They were personal vehicles, cars, pickups, and even a few motorcycles, decorated with tribal flags and symbols. At their head rode James Eagle Feather and Elder Standing Bear. The convoy pulled into Harold's driveway, and nearly 24 people emerged. Most were young men and women, though there were elders among them as well. They approached the porch respectfully, James Eagle Feather stepping forward as their spokesman. "Mr. Winters, we've come as promised. These are volunteers from 3 tribes, all descendants of the ancient river people, whose remains rest on your land. They're here to serve as guardians of the site." Harold stood, deeply moved by the gesture. "I'm honored, but I'm not sure what—" Elder Standing Bear stepped forward. "We've heard about the developers' new plans to surround your land. This is not just about protecting the burial ground anymore. It's about standing against the kind of greed that has taken so much from our peoples over the centuries." The elder's eyes held Harold's. "You kept faith with our ancestors for 50 years. Now we keep faith with you." Over the next few days, the tribal guardians established a camp near the archaeological site. They worked in shifts, maintaining a 24-hour presence that was part practical security, part spiritual vigil. Dr. Rodriguez and her team welcomed the assistance, incorporating traditional knowledge into their scientific work. The presence of the tribal guardians transformed the atmosphere on the farm. What had been a lonely stand against a powerful corporation now felt like a community united by a common purpose. Even the media narrative shifted, with national outlets picking up the story of indigenous peoples and a rural farmer joining forces against corporate development. Governor Richards visited again, meeting with tribal leaders and touring the archaeological site, where work was progressing rapidly. The ground-penetrating radar had revealed not just the burial site, but a more extensive settlement than anyone had expected. Each new discovery strengthened the case for permanent protection. "Price is scrambling," the governor told Harold as they watched the archaeologists at work. His investors are getting nervous about the negative publicity and potential legal challenges. The fraud charges aren't helping either. "But he's still buying up all the surrounding land," Harold pointed out. "True," the governor acknowledged. "And that's a problem we need to address. His new strategy is legally sound, even if it's ethically questionable." Later that day, Harold called a family meeting. Matthew and Emily arrived with their spouses, and they gathered around the old oak table that had hosted Winters' family discussions for generations. "I've been thinking about what Price said," Harold began, "about surrounding us with development so dense we won't be able to see the sunset anymore." He looked each family member in the eye. "I've spent my life protecting this land, first as a farmer, then as a guardian of the burial site, but maybe it's time for a new approach." Emily leaned forward, concerned. "You're not considering selling, are you, Grandpa?" Harold shook his head firmly. "No, never that. But I am considering a different kind of future for the farm." He pulled out a folder containing notes and sketches. "What if, instead of just fighting against Price's development, we created something of our own? Something that would preserve the land while serving a greater purpose?" Matthew looked intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "A heritage center," Harold said, warming to his idea. "Part working farm, part educational facility. We could showcase sustainable agricultural practices alongside the archaeological site. Create a place where people could learn about both the farming history of this region and its indigenous past." The concept sparked immediate enthusiasm. Emily, who had studied education before choosing to become a schoolteacher, began envisioning programs for children. Matthew, with his agricultural background, suggested demonstration plots for traditional and modern farming techniques. "We could partner with the tribes," Emily suggested excitedly. "Make it a truly collaborative space that honors all the layers of history here." And we'll need to involve Dr. Rodriguez and her team, Matthew added. The archaeological site would be the centerpiece, but carefully protected. Harold watched his grandchildren with pride as they built upon his initial idea, transforming it into something far more comprehensive than he had imagined. This was why he had fought so hard, not just to preserve the past, but to create possibilities for the future. "There's just one problem," Emily said finally, bringing them back to reality. "How do we fund something like this? And how do we prevent Price from surrounding us with development that would make this vision impossible?" Harold smiled. "As for funding, I've already spoken with Jack, Governor Richards. He believes there are state grants available for heritage preservation and educational initiatives. As for Price," his smile turned determined, "I think it's time we took the fight to him." The next morning, Harold placed a call to Leonard Price's office requesting a meeting. To his surprise, Price agreed immediately, suggesting they meet that afternoon at a neutral location, a local diner halfway between the farm and the city. "Are you sure about this, Grandpa?" Matthew asked as he drove Harold to the meeting. "Price isn't exactly stable right now." "Sometimes the best way to disarm your opponent is to face them directly," Harold replied. "Besides, I've got an offer that might surprise him." The diner was nearly empty when they arrived. Price sat alone in a corner booth, his usual entourage of lawyers and assistants notably absent. He looked tired, the strain of recent events evident in the lines of his face. "Winters," he acknowledged, as Harold slid into the booth across from him. "I have to admit, I'm curious what could possibly bring you to reach out to me." Harold studied the man who had become his nemesis. In another context, they might have respected each other. Both were determined, resilient men who didn't back down easily. But their values were fundamentally opposed. "I have a proposition for you," Harold said finally. "One that might allow us both to get something we want." Price raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "You can build your development," Harold began, "but not the way you've planned it." And with that opening, Harold Winters laid out a vision that would change not just his farm, but the entire community surrounding it. A vision that would test whether Leonard Price valued profit above all else, or if there was room in his worldview for a different kind of legacy. Price leaned back in the booth, his expression guarded as Harold explained his vision. The diner's ambient noise faded into the background, the clinking of coffee cups, the sizzle of the grill, the murmured conversations, as the two adversaries focused entirely on each other. "Let me get this straight," Price said when Harold finished. "Instead of your standard luxury development with a golf course and exclusive neighborhoods, you want me to create some kind of heritage-focused community that preserves green space and incorporates elements of the region's agricultural and indigenous history." Harold nodded. "The homes can still be upscale. I'm not asking you to abandon your target market. But instead of isolating my farm as an island, you'd integrate it as the centerpiece. The Winters Heritage Center would be a community asset, not an obstacle." Price's eyes narrowed. "And why exactly would I do this? Your proposal would significantly reduce the number of units I could build, which means less profit." "But potentially faster approval and construction," Harold countered. "Think about it. You're facing significant obstacles with your current plan. The Tribal Coalition is prepared to file lawsuits under the National Historic Preservation Act. Environmental groups are mobilizing over concerns about Elk Creek's watershed. The fraud charges have made local officials wary of fast-tracking anything with your name on it." Harold paused, letting this reality sink in. "My proposal comes with the support of Governor Richards, the tribes, and the community that rallied around my farm. The permitting process would be smoother, the public relations value enormous." For the first time since their confrontation began, something shifted in Price's expression, a calculating interest replacing the blind anger. "You've thought this through," he admitted grudgingly. but I still don't see why I should help create a monument to the man who cost me millions and damaged my reputation." Harold smiled faintly. "Because it's an opportunity to repair that reputation, to transform from villain to visionary." He leaned forward. "And because deep down, I think you recognize that some things are worth more than maximizing short-term profits." Price snorted. "You don't know me, Winters." "Maybe not," Harold acknowledged. "But I know you didn't get where you are by being short-sighted. The development paradigm is shifting. Communities are pushing back against cookie-cutter subdivisions that erase local character and history. What I'm proposing is the future. Development that enhances rather than destroys what makes a place special." Price gazed out the window, watching traffic pass on the main street. For a moment, his carefully maintained facade seemed to crack, revealing a glimpse of weariness. "My investors won't like it," he said finally. "Some might not," Harold agreed. "But others will see the potential. This could be a showcase project, something truly unique in the region. And let's be honest, your current plan is stalled indefinitely. Half a project that moves forward is better than a whole project that never breaks ground." The diner had emptied out, the lunch rush over. Their coffee cups had been refilled twice as they talked, the conversation evolving from adversarial negotiation to something approaching a genuine dialogue. Price had begun asking questions that weren't merely challenging, but showed real engagement with the concept. Questions about implementation, phasing, marketing. "I'd need my planners to work up new schematics," Price said, making notes on a napkin. "Reconfigure the lot layouts, redesign the amenities." "Emily's husband is an architect specializing in sustainable design," Harold offered. "He's already sketched some preliminary ideas for the Heritage Center. Might be worth consulting him for the integration with your development." Price looked up, a hint of his old sharpness returning. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Winters. I haven't agreed to anything yet." "Of course not," Harold replied calmly, "but you're considering it. That's a start." As they prepared to leave, Price fixed Harold with an assessing gaze. "You know, in 40 years of development, I've never substantially altered a project design to accommodate a holdout. What makes you so different?" Harold considered the question seriously. "It's not about me, Mr. Price. It's about what that land represents. Centuries of history, both seen and unseen. My family's been its caretaker for a few generations, but our time is just a blink in its story." He shook his head. "I'm not a holdout. I'm a steward." Something in those words seemed to land. Price extended his hand, not with his usual aggressive confidence, but with a measure of reluctant respect. "I'll have my team develop an alternative plan based on your concept," he said as they shook hands. "No promises beyond that." "That's all I'm asking for now," Harold replied. When Harold returned to the farm, he found it buzzing with activity. Dr. Rodriguez's team had made another significant discovery, a cache of ceremonial objects that further confirmed the site's historical importance. Representatives from the state's Historical Preservation Office were documenting everything meticulously, while tribal guardians maintained a respectful presence at the perimeter. Matthew met him at the driveway, eager for news. "How did it go with Price? Did he laugh you out of the diner?" "Actually," Harold said, surprising himself with a chuckle, "I think we might have the beginnings of a breakthrough." Over the next 2 weeks, an unusual collaboration took shape. Price's design team worked alongside Emily's husband and tribal representatives to develop a new vision for the land surrounding the Winters farm. Governor Richards arranged meetings with state agencies to explore funding options for the Heritage Center, while Dr. Rodriguez's team continued their archaeological work, each new discovery adding weight to the site's significance. The shift in Price himself was perhaps the most remarkable development. The man who had arrived at Harold's farm threatening revenge now seemed genuinely engaged with the alternative vision. He still drove hard bargains on technical details and financial arrangements, But the malice had faded, replaced by a businessman's pragmatic assessment of a changed situation. A month after their diner meeting, Price arrived at the farm with his lead architect and a set of presentation boards. The Winters family gathered in the living room, joined by James Eagle Feather, Elder Standing Bear, and Governor Richards. What Price unveiled surprised them all. Winters Heritage Community, he announced, revealing a master plan that went beyond even what Harold had proposed. The development still featured upscale homes, but they were clustered in thoughtfully designed neighborhoods that preserved large swaths of open space. The Heritage Center formed the heart of the community, with walking trails connecting it to residential areas. Most surprisingly, the plan included a restored section of Elk Creek with protected riparian habitat along its banks. "The creek restoration was my idea," Price said, noting their surprised expressions. "After reviewing the historical maps, we realized that returning it to something closer to its pre-1973 course would create a natural boundary between the development and the archaeological site." He shrugged, a gesture uncharacteristically humble for the usually brash developer. It made sense ecologically and aesthetically. The presentation continued, with Price's architect explaining how the community would incorporate sustainable features, renewable energy, water conservation, native landscaping, alongside architectural elements that honored both agricultural and indigenous heritage. When they finished, the room fell silent for a moment. Then Elder Standing Bear rose slowly, his weathered face solemn. "When the water returned to its ancient path," he said, gesturing to the creek restoration on the plans, "the circle becomes complete. The ancestors will rest well, knowing their place in this land is honored." He turned to Price. "This plan respects what came before while creating something new. There is wisdom in that balance." Price nodded, accepting the elder's words with unexpected gravity. "There are still details to work out," he cautioned, turning to Harold. "Financing, phasing, legal structures for the Heritage Center. This won't be simple." "The right paths rarely are," Harold replied. As the meeting concluded and the visitors began to depart, Harold walked Price to his car. The evening sun bathed the fields in golden light, the same timeless panorama that had captivated Harold's ancestors generations ago. "Why did you really change your approach?" Harold asked, giving voice to the question that had nagged at him throughout the presentation. "It wasn't just business calculation." Price paused, keys in hand, looking out over the farm. For the first time, Harold sensed he might be seeing the man beneath the developer's polished persona. "My grandfather was a farmer," Price said finally, his voice quiet. "Lost everything in the Dust Bowl. Moved to the city, never spoke about the land again. But he kept a jar of soil from that farm until the day he died." He met Harold's eyes. "Sometimes we spend our lives trying to rebuild what was lost, only to destroy what others have preserved." With that cryptic statement, Price nodded a goodbye and drove away, leaving Harold to contemplate how the most unyielding conflicts sometimes find resolution in unexpected common ground. 2 years passed. The once quiet landscape around the Winters farm had transformed, yet somehow remained true to its essence. The Winters Heritage Community had broken ground 18 months earlier, after navigating the complex maze of permits, environmental reviews, and financing arrangements. Now, the first phase of homes was complete, their architecture a thoughtful blend of modern comfort and traditional rural elements. Harold stood on the porch of the farmhouse, now the centerpiece of the Winters Heritage Center, watching a group of schoolchildren follow Emily along a trail that wound through demonstration gardens, showcasing traditional agricultural practices. His granddaughter had left her teaching position to become the center's education director, her passion for sharing knowledge finding perfect expression in this new role. "They're getting the good stuff today," Matthew commented, joining his grandfather on the porch. "Indigenous planting techniques in the Three Sisters Gardens. Emily's really refined that presentation. Harold nodded, pride evident in his smile. Marion would have loved seeing this. She always said Emily had a gift for teaching. The Heritage Center had exceeded even Harold's ambitious vision. The main barn had been carefully renovated into an exhibition space where rotating displays told the story of the land, from its earliest indigenous inhabitants through European settlement and modern farming. The archaeological site, now permanently protected under federal and tribal oversight, was accessible through guided tours that emphasized both scientific and cultural perspectives. Most remarkably, Elk Creek had indeed been partially restored to its pre-1973 course, creating a beautiful, meandering waterway that served as both ecological habitat and natural boundary. The reconstruction had revealed additional archaeological evidence, further confirming the site's historical significance. Hard to believe how much has changed, Harold mused, his gaze traveling to the new homes visible in the distance. They were designed to nestle into the landscape rather than dominate it, with generous green space between neighborhoods. Matthew chuckled. Even harder to believe that Leonard Price is now on the board of the Heritage Foundation. That had perhaps been the most unexpected development of all. Price's legal troubles had eventually been resolved through a combination of settlements and community service agreements. Rather than distancing himself from the project that had replaced his original vision, he had become increasingly involved, bringing his business acumen to the foundation that oversaw the Heritage Center. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A familiar black SUV pulled into the parking area, and Price emerged, accompanied by a distinguished-looking couple. "Right on time," Matthew observed. "The potential donors?" Harold nodded. "The Williamson Foundation. They're interested in funding an expansion of the educational programs." "I'll let Emily know they're here," Matthew said, heading toward the trail where his sister was just concluding her presentation. Harold made his way down the porch steps to greet the visitors. At 78, he moved more slowly now, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit unbowed. Price met him halfway, extending a hand in the greeting that had become familiar over months of collaboration. "Harold, good to see you. Allow me to introduce Raymond and Eleanor Williamson. Their foundation supports heritage preservation projects across the state." "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Winters," Eleanor Williamson said warmly. "What you've created here is remarkable, a true model for how development and preservation can coexist." "The credit belongs to many," Harold replied modestly, "including Mr. Price here, who had the flexibility to reimagine what was possible." Price shook his head with a small smile. "Some lessons come at a higher cost than others. I'm just glad we found a better path forward." The transformation in their relationship still occasionally caught Harold by surprise. The bitter adversary had become, if not exactly a friend, then a respected partner in something meaningful. Price had discovered that attaching his name to a heritage preservation project offered a different kind of legacy than another cookie-cutter development. As they toured the center, Harold observed the genuine interest in the Williamsons' questions and comments. By the time they reached the archaeological site, where Dr. Rodriguez herself provided an overview of the ongoing research, it was clear their engagement was more than polite curiosity. "We'd like to discuss a substantive endowment," Raymond Williamson announced as they concluded their tour back at the farmhouse. "Not just for current programs, but to ensure the center's sustainability for generations to come." After the Williamsons departed, promising to have their foundation's lawyers draft a proposal, Price lingered on the porch with Harold. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property as they sat in comfortable silence. Two men who had once been bitter enemies, now bound by a shared accomplishment. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out this way?" Price asked finally. "That day when I showed up with bulldozers?" Harold shook his head. "Not in my wildest dreams. I just knew I couldn't let the land go." "I've been developing properties for over 40 years, Price said, his gaze taking in the center and the community beyond. Built thousands of homes, dozens of shopping centers, office parks, made millions. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his usually composed features. This is the first project that feels like it might outlast me, like it matters. Before Harold could respond, James Eagle Feather approached, accompanying a group of tribal elders who had traveled from several states away to visit the site. The formal opening ceremony for the completed Heritage Center was scheduled for the following weekend, coinciding with the seasonal harvest festival that had become an annual tradition. "Mr. Winters," James called out, "these elders would like to speak with you before tomorrow's preparation ceremonies." Harold rose to greet them, noting Price tactfully excusing himself to give them privacy. The eldest of the visitors, a woman whose face was mapped with deeply etched lines of wisdom, took Harold's hands in hers. "We have come to honor the keeper of our ancestors' resting place," she said, her voice soft but carrying authority. "For 50 years you guarded what you did not understand but respected nonetheless. Now, as the circle closes, we bring you this." From a beautifully beaded pouch, she withdrew a small carved stone figure, a simple human form with hands raised toward the sky. This was created by our ancestors in the time before memory. It has been in our keeping, but now belongs here with those who sleep beneath this land. You will be its final guardian before it returns to the earth. Tears welled in Harold's eyes as he accepted the sacred object with trembling hands. "I am honored, beyond words," he managed to say. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the farmhouse, Harold seemed unusually quiet, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Finally, Emily broke the contemplative silence. "What is it, Grandpa? You've been a million miles away tonight." Harold smiled faintly. "Not miles, years. I was thinking about your grandmother, about the promise we made when we learned about the burial site, about how things work out in ways you never expect." He rose from his chair, moving to the old roll-top desk in the corner where he retrieved a worn leather journal. "I've been keeping this since the day we discovered the site. It's time you both had it." Matthew accepted the journal with reverent hands. "Your record of the site? And my thoughts over the years. About the land, about our responsibility to it." Harold's eyes grew distant. "When you live long enough, you realize we're all just temporary caretakers. The land was here before us and will remain after we're gone. What matters is what we do with our brief time as its guardians." The following weekend, hundreds gathered for the Heritage Center's grand opening. The governor, now in his second term, delivered a moving speech about preservation and progress-finding harmony. Tribal representatives performed blessing ceremonies. Children from local schools presented projects based on what they'd learned about the region's agricultural and indigenous heritage. As Harold watched from a seat of honor, surrounded by his family, he felt a profound sense of completion. The fight that had begun with his solitary stand against bulldozers had evolved into something far more significant than he could have imagined, a community united around preserving the past while building a sustainable future. Later, as the celebration continued, Harold slipped away quietly, walking alone to the north field where Elk Creek now flowed along its restored path. The setting sun painted the water with ribbons of gold and crimson as he stood in silent communion with the land that had defined his life. From this vantage point, he could see both the Heritage Center and the new community beyond. Children played in the common green spaces between clusters of homes. Families strolled along the creekside trail. On a distant hill, a tribal guardian kept his watchful presence over the sacred site. "We did it, Marion," Harold whispered to his wife's memory. "The land is safe. Its stories will be remembered." A gentle breeze rustled through the wheat field behind him, carrying the sweet scent of earth and growing things. To Harold, it felt like an answer, nature's quiet acknowledgement of promises kept and legacies secured. As darkness began to settle over the valley, Matthew appeared at his grandfather's side, offering his arm for support. Together they walked back toward the lights of the farmhouse, where family and friends awaited. The past and future connected in an unbroken chain of stewardship that would endure long after the story of one stubborn farmer's stand against developers had faded into local legend. But some legacies don't need to be remembered to endure. They live on in the land itself, in the rhythm of seasons, in the careful balance between human needs and natural systems. Harold Winters had fought not just for his farm, but for something timeless. The understanding that some things, once lost, can never be replaced, and that standing firm against the tide of pure profit is sometimes the only way to preserve what truly matters. And in that, he had succeeded beyond measure.